Welcome to the West Virginia Legislature on the West Virginia Channel. I'm Beth Voorhees. Today we'll join the Senate Finance Committee for budget presentations by the Department of Education and the West Virginia School Building Authority. We'll join the Senate Finance Committee as soon as it's called to order. Please stand by.
Clerk will determine if we have a quorum by silent roll call. I believe we do. I'm going to recognize the Vice Chairman for motion to approve the minutes of the previous meeting, which was held on the 20th, I think.
Approve minutes from February 20th.
Motion is to approve the minutes of February 20th. All in favor say aye. Opposed the same. All right, minutes are approved. Well, today we dig into a section of the budget that's pretty expansive, and we're going to hear from Dr. Martirano, who's going to make the presentation. I told him to focus on the money issues, but they're manifold in the Department of Education and in education in general. So he's got a budget request presentation, which is pretty good if you want to follow along in it. In our book 3, some of you, if you ever want to look, it's tab 3, page 9, to look at the actual expenditures as they're out on the file we've created. All right, Dr. Martirano, if you want to proceed.
Senators, good afternoon. I'm Dr. Michael Martirano, the State Superintendent for the great state of West Virginia. It's great to see all of you. I recognize the direction, and this is the 4th presentation I've done. I've been before the House Ed and Senate Ed, as well as now the House Finance and Senate Finance. And I'm trying to stay very clear to my focus regarding the presentation. All of you should have in front of you the document that looks like this that you'll also see scrolling on the screen. We've tried to make a very complex budget very simple so that all of our citizens and everyone within our state can fully understand what we do, why we do, and how much money is allocated. And so I'm going to quickly move through this because I recognize your time is precious and we want to get into the specific numbers, but I'm going to move through this in a way that you understand where our dollars are. First and foremost, the point that I want to make is our overall educational budget is approximately $2.4 billion. And you'll see the spreadsheet, and we'll go through the exact numbers of how we come up with our revenues and then our expenditures. The main thing that I want you to understand up front is that 97% of those dollars pass directly through the Department of Education, and they go to the counties to run all of our school systems, paying for teacher salaries, transportation, all of the things necessary to run. So the main role of the department regarding the finances is as an accountability agent to ensure that all the dollars are properly accounted for and spent as where we define them based upon statute, policy, legislation, and federal expectations as well. I want you to turn to page 4, and I'm going to quickly move through page 4. As I've said in my other presentations in the last week, there's oftentimes great consternation about the overall staffing within the educational budget, and I thought in a very clear way I would go through this quickly. In the Department of Education, there are 1,134 positions. Those are full-time FTEs that are defined in there. I want you to also recognize that 11 of those positions are the school building authority. Those do not report to the state superintendent. The two bubbles below, you'll see an orange one and a blue one. 811 of those positions report directly to the Board of Education, to the State Board of Education. And to the right, 312 of those positions report to the Department of Education, mainly under my supervision as State Superintendent. And quickly, I want to go through from the left to the right. 459 of those positions do not report to me, directly report to the State Board of Education, go to the Reeses. 163 positions report to the State Board of Education. They are for the School for the Deaf and the Blind. And maybe you want to take a note there. There are 125 students at the School for the Deaf and the Blind with 163 positions. The Office of Diversion, the Office of Diversion and Transition Programs, there are 176 positions associated with that, and for the juveniles only, they report to the State Board of Education. There are 9 positions associated with the Office of Educational Performance Audit, better known as OEPA, and all of those report to the State Board. And then there are 4 positions that report to the State Board of Education. Below, for their staff. Below you will see in the magenta and the green, I've broken those out further as state-funded positions. Those are in the educational budget as actual full-time equivalents. And then the green you will see are non-state funded positions, being that they are funded through federal funds, grants, collection accounts such as Medicaid, et cetera. Do keep in mind that the Department of Education, the Arts, and the Center for Professional Development does not report to the Department of Education, and none of those monies allocated to those organizations are in the Department of Education's budget. Going quickly to the right, when we talk about the positions in Building 6, the Department of Education, there are 239 positions that directly report to me as State Superintendent contained in Building 6. 151 of those are funded by state funds, and 88 of those are the other positions that I had just talked about, how they're funded through non-state funded positions. Now, a little nuance. There are 73 positions that report to under my supervision for the Office of Diversion and Transition Program for adults. The State Board had the juveniles, and the adults report to the State Superintendent. 65 of those positions are state funded, and 8 of which are federal funded in terms of grants, et cetera, for a total of 8,000 adults that we're providing the services. Now again, I want to break that out even further. The services provided for the adults are adult basic education services, so that when an individual goes through the system, that when they come out, that they have a skill which they can now enter into society to cut down on the recidivism rate. The other piece is the aspect of CTE and adult basic education regarding GED and TAS, so that they want to have the GED as well. Back over to the other side, when we talk about the juveniles, there are approximately 2,600 students enrolled in those programs, in those facilities, and we provide a full battering of offerings for our young people contained who are in school, who are school age, so that they receive science, social studies, English, and math, and we provide whole school services with principals and supports in that area. But as I've said in my other presentations, I want to direct you back to what code says, code 1820-5-A-5, and specifically I want to highlight this as we're looking at areas regarding saving of dollars. Basically states that we provide services for adults in that particular part of code if funds are available. Funds therefore. So that's a conversation piece as we're looking at our budget issues. I want to continue to go over onto page 5, if I could, to show you the reduction in staff over time, particularly in the department, Building 6. At the time of the education efficient audit, there were 319 positions at the Department of Education. Now, in January of 2017, we have 239 positions, and that is an approximate 25% reduction during that period of time. I've also, as a data point of comparison, have also put the enrollment decreases have continued in the state of West Virginia in a way that we've, during that period of time, we lost approximately 9,000 students from our public schools, and that was a 3.2% reduction as well. The next item that I want to talk to you about is on page 6, and you've been hearing a lot of conversation in the media about this particular item. As we talk about the funding for education, one of my most critical impact areas is regarding our teacher vacancies. Currently, we have approximately 718 vacancies across the state. I'm viewing that as a crisis across our state that has increased exponentially over the last 3-4 years, and it's all across in all the various areas. I've presented several different ways of which we need to address that. I'm very pleased that the governor has included in his budget a 2% raise for our teachers, but do recognize that that is just a drop in the bucket where we are with our average salaries, because our average ranking in our salaries is approximately 46, 47, depending upon what indicator you look. We are truly behind the 8 ball when it comes to recruiting and retaining, and so my focus is on in terms of supporting the educational dollars to support raises, but also look at our personnel laws and policies to lighten those up in ways and to lessen those impacts, of which is creating concern for our superintendents to hire the very best individuals. It's a highly competitive area, and keep in mind that the states and the counties that are saying that they're addressing this is based upon the fact that they're able to pay them more and recognize the competitive nature of where we are. And again, as I move through that very quickly, I do want to end, before I bring Terry and Amy up, to acknowledge that we have extreme financial accountability measures in place at the department. And again, 97% of our overall educational budget goes directly out to our counties, and there's very little discretionary dollars. In many ways, those categories are set and things that we must do. I'm now going to ask Terry Harless, who is the Chief Financial Officer, and Amy Willard from his department to go into the specific numbers, recognizing the amount of time of which we have. Thank you for your time. Terry, please come forward.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. I'm Terry Harless, the Chief Financial Officer for the Department of Education. We do appreciate this opportunity to talk about our budget. It is, as Dr. Martirano expressed, a very large budget, nearly $2.5 billion. Represents about 44% of the state's entire general and lottery appropriations. We've improved the book, we believe, a little bit this year, so we're going to do a very brief presentation to you. A lot of the information is in there, including this year we've included descriptions for each and every line item with that the department has, nearly 140 line items. The book, as you'll find, as you'll see, has 5 columns. That first column is our current 17 appropriation. Followed, the second column is the appropriation request that we submitted back last September 1st, as agencies do. Third column is the difference between now and that request back on September 1. Fourth column is the recent governor's recommendation, and that fifth column, that difference between what the department submitted last September and what the governor has recommended. The reason we do that, so many columns, is you'll see in that third column that difference. When you look at state aid, for example, you see some steps that had a reduction in appropriations due to decreased enrollment. But if you look in the fifth column, you'll see where, with the governor's recommendation of teacher raises, that there'll be an increase. So that's why we've done that. We'll just look at selected items. In many cases, there were no changes. There are line items that have been around for many years. We'll just talk about a few of those that perhaps did have changes. In that first fund, we do have 7 general funds, a lottery fund, 4 federal funds. In that first fund, that's our Fund 0303. The school lunch program, that's just about $2.5 million. That's a match, serves as a match for approximately $146 million in federal funds that we draw from the U.S. Department of Agriculture, primarily to reimburse meals within the schools. There were no changes there. It is important that we do try our best not to ever reduce a line like that, because it's a maintenance of effort, a matching sort of line, and we could perhaps reduce federal appropriations if we did so. The next section, we call it our Fund 0313, State Department of Education. Actually, a little bit of a misnomer. Most of these funds do not go to the department. They go through the department and on to counties. This is why we've separated into these 3 segments. This first segment, those are some lines that are primarily formula-based. Line 4, worth mentioning, the teacher's retirement savings realized. That's an item that began to appear in the department's budget back in 2014, when there was a legislative opportunity to allow teachers who had been in a TDC plan, a 401k type plan, to revert back into the teacher's retirement system, a defined benefit plan if they chose, and that any savings captured as a result of that larger pool of participants would be identified and put back into the teacher's retirement system. So that number is determined by a third-party actuary, and we just simply remit those funds to the CPRB. The next few lines, again, are also enrollment-driven. Increased enrollment, you can see that has been lowered through the years because we are seeing decreased enrollment across the state. There are pockets of increased enrollment, and so that helps to fund those. Safe Schools funds alternative schools. Alternative students in schools at $18 per student, and there are fewer students, so you see reduction there, and a few others. I will note line 9 is the RESA line. That was the supplemental line of approximately $3.6 million, and the governor has recommended zeroing that line out. That next section on the bottom of that page are what we term as our other funds distributed to LEAs, local education agencies. No changes there. I'll move on to the next page. And we'll go on into departmental operations. Again, no changes there either, except for one slight in the far right column toward the bottom of that department operations section. There's simply an inflationary increase for the department's BRIM premium. That takes us to Fund 0314. That's our Aid for Exceptional Children and Institutional Programs. There are 4 lines there. That first one is those are funds, state funds that go to counties for special ed purposes. The next 3 lines fund the 249 employees that the department has who are teachers, service personnel, and administrators out in institutional facilities across the state, 42 institutions. As Dr. Monterano said, there are 239 employees in Building 6, 249, however, in addition to that, out in these institutional facilities. Most are correctional facilities, juveniles and adults. To a lesser degree, there are some DHHR facilities who are able to educate children, perhaps who are in transition and such due to issues other than correctional reasons. With that, we're at Fund 0317. I'm going to step away for just a second. Amy Willard, our Director of School Finance, is going to talk about that 0317, our largest fund, otherwise known as our State Aid to Schools Fund, and then I'll come back and close out. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. My name is Amy Willard, and I'm the Executive Director of School Finance for the State Department. Fund 0317, State Aid to Schools, contains the basic state aid funding for the county boards of education under the Public School Support Plan. The primary driver for state aid funding is student enrollment, which declined significantly from fiscal year 16 to fiscal year 17. Our headcount enrollment dropped 3,968 students in 1 year. So I'm going to kind of go through step by step through the funding formula. The decrease in enrollment resulted in fewer state aid funded positions for professional educators under step 1 of the funding formula, which is why our initial request was $12.8 million less for fiscal year 18 compared to fiscal year 17. However, you will see in that line that the governor is recommending a 2% pay increase for classroom teachers, which is why the step 1 amount shows an increase of $15.4 million in the far right-hand column. The decrease in enrollment also resulted in fewer state aid funded positions for service personnel under step 2 of the funding formula, but that original request was partially offset by a statutorily required request for the amount of additional funding necessary to bring the service personnel salary tables back within equity. The current monthly equity amount for service personnel is $164 per month, but it would need to be increased to $184 per month to bring the tables within the statutory definition of equity. You will see that the estimated cost of $2.4 million to fund that equity increase is not being recommended by the governor in his budget, which is reflected as a reduction in the far right-hand column. Step 3 for fixed charges or fringe benefits is calculated as a percentage of the salary allowance steps. So our original request for fiscal year 18 was less due to the decline in student enrollment. However, that increase that you'll see in the far right-hand column is due to the 2% pay increase for classroom teachers. Step 4 for student transportation decreased for fiscal year 18 primarily due to lower fuel costs reported by the county boards of education, offset by an increase in bus replacement funding. Bus replacement funding had been capped at $15 million in fiscal year 16 and $18 million in fiscal year 17, but the cap is removed in the statute for fiscal year 18. Step 5 did not see any changes from our fiscal year 17 request because the funding for counselors and nurses is set in statute at the fiscal year 13 level. Step 6 is calculated as a percentage of the salary allowances, so the original WVDE request decreased due to the decline in student enrollment, which had resulted in the fewer funded positions. The increase in the governor's recommended budget in the far right-hand column is due to the 2% pay increase for classroom teachers. The amounts requested for Step 7A and 7B are the same as the previous year based on the way those amounts are calculated per the statute. Those steps are calculated as the previous year appropriation plus an increase in the percentage of local share for the year. But because the local share is actually decreasing for fiscal year 18, the amount requested for Steps 7A and 7B remained at the previous year appropriation level. The slight increase that you'll see in our original request for Step 7C was due to an increase in the number of students enrolled in advanced placement courses. So the original basic foundation allowance request decreased a total of $21.8 million from fiscal year 17 to fiscal year 18, which is reflected in line 60. But you will see that the governor's recommended adjustments increased our originally requested amounts by $15.7 million in total. In line 61, you'll see that local share, which is the portion that each county board of education can contribute towards the cost of the education program based on their regular levy tax collections, is projected to decrease by $13.3 million from fiscal year 17 to fiscal year 18. This estimate is based on information provided by the State Tax Department, and it will be updated in March when we receive the actual assessed values by the county assessors. You'll see that the adjustments for taxes not collected and payments in lieu of taxes, those are also based on a report from the State Tax Department based on information they collect from the county assessors, and there are only minor variances from the amounts reported for fiscal year 17. Due to the decrease in local share, the amount of basic state aid funding needed overall for the county boards of education increases. So our $21.8 million reduction is offset by the $13.3 million local share change for an overall reduction in basic state aid in line 65 of only $8.5 million in our original funding request. That amount is then being increased by the governor by the $15.7 million that I had previously mentioned. You'll see in line 66, PEIA funding, that amount increased approximately $1.3 million from the previous year. In fiscal year 17, the appropriation amount was reduced by amounts on deposit or reserve with PEIA. So even though there are actually fewer state aid eligible positions being funded for fiscal year 18 and there's no projected employer premium increase included, all of those reserve funds that we had on hand and used during this current year are expected to be depleted, and therefore our actual appropriation request went up slightly to cover the PEIA obligations for the county boards of education. The amounts included in WVDE's original appropriation request on line 67 and 69 for the teachers' retirement system are based on information that we received from CPRB's actuaries. Our original request was based on estimates provided by CPRB since the final actuarial report regarding the unfunded retirement liability was not yet completed in December when our funding request was due. And at that time, CPRB was estimating that the total amount needed to fund retirement for fiscal year 18 was approximately $40.95 million higher than the amounts needed for fiscal year 17. Subsequent to the submission of our request in December, the final actuarial report was issued. That actuarial report, combined with the slight additional amount needed to cover the 2% pay increase for classroom teachers, means that the amount of funding needed for retirement increased an additional $32.57 million over the originally requested amounts. The increased amounts were included in the governor's recommendation in that far right-hand column. So in conclusion, on line 70, the total $82.1 million increase in state aid funding from the fiscal year 17 actual amount to the governor's fiscal year 18 recommended amount is primarily due to that statutorily required funding for the teachers' retirement system, combined with the recommendation for the 2% classroom teacher salary increase, and then that slight adjustment due to the decrease in local share. So I will turn things back over to Terry.
And I'll just finish out starting with Fund 0390 CTE programs. There are 11 line items within that fund. You'll note that 3 of them have some changes. Amy just noted that the majority of teachers and service personnel are funded through the formula. There are a few beyond that. In this case, you see increases for those same statutory increases that we do otherwise. For teachers in vocational centers, teachers and service personnel in vocational centers. The largest of those lines is line 76, the vocational aid, at approximately $22 million. The majority of those funds do go to fund the vocational centers, the materials and supplies and such they use for normal use, but those teachers are teaching those adult classes. You often find the vocational centers very, very busy in any given evening, and in line 148, those are classes for teaching adults trade skills, welding and plumbing and electrical and all those things. Line 1, the next line, line 77, adult basic education, those are teachers teaching adults academic skills, basic academic skills. That completes the general funds. We have one lottery fund with some 4 or 5 line items there. The largest of those is that last one on that next page 11. And you'll see that's our line 88, 21st Century Tech Infrastructure Network Tools and Support, otherwise known as Tools for Schools. Those are funds that continue to install computers, broadband, other paraphernalia to that effect in schools. It also helps support the WEVA system that all counties use, the centralized accounting system that counties use. Now, we move on to other funds. There is one other fund, 3937, Strategic Staff Development, and per code, those are net magistrate court proceeds that the department receives every year for that purpose of strategic staff development. And that leaves our four final federal funds. The 8712, we call it our consolidated fund, and that's basically spending authority for most of the larger federal programs that the department has, the ESSA or the title programs, Title I, Title II, Title VI, those kinds of programs. The 8713 or school nutrition. Now there is one improvement that we had requested back on September 1, and that was for additional spending authority for those federal funds. This is the federal fund that the department has experienced the most growth in by far, actually. The state was just awarded as the top participant in school breakfast programs across the country. I believe that was the third consecutive year that they'd received that award, and a lot of other initiatives that have happened in school nutrition. Fund 8714 is the CTE programs. That's the complement to those 0390 state programs. Those are primarily Perkins funds. Next page is our 8712 special programs or IDEA funds. And that fund has remained fairly constant at needing a spending authority of approximately $112 million. There are two other funds, just as Dr. Monroe mentioned, the distinction between the board and the department up front. These are two funds that are under the oversight of the board. 0573, the Office of Educational Performance Audits, or OEPA, and the Schools for the Deaf and Blind in Romney. And again, as Dr. Monterano mentioned, it's approximately a total of $2.5 billion. And the only other thing I did want to mention was we don't have it on the electronic version here, but you do have a handout that gives you a total. Just a good way to kind of sum up all the things that Amy and I have said. You should have a page that, to this effect, that says West Virginia Department of Education budget comparison. And just quickly, as Amy mentioned, you'll see there was actually a net increase between this year and the governor's recommendation for next year of nearly $90 million. As you come to the bottom of that page, you'll see that $15 million of it was federal spending authority. That still leaves approximately $75 million in an increase. And the middle section kind of identifies what the bulk of those increases were. Actually a net increase, some are reductions. There was a decrease in basic state aid due to the enrollment loss of approximately $22 million. You have a $13 million additional cost because the local share, which normally rises each year, actually had a decrease. But as you see mid-page, primarily the increase was a net $70.5 million in necessary teachers' retirement system funding, and there are a few other items there as well. But with that, that completes our presentation.
All right. I'm going to take questions. I'll just make a brief comment before we do. Obviously, in a $4.5 billion budget, or 4.1 or 2, or wherever we can end up with our spending, this is a significant area of spending. And for those who would call for reductions in government or reductions in funding, to get to some of the levels that some people are talking about, it would be, the challenge would be to look at this section. And you've heard the presentation. You know, I've been here for a long time. The minority leader has been a former finance chairman and education chairman. Actually, I sat under him in the House 20 years ago. Understanding the school aid formula, I thought that was a very good short explanation. I took notes on what drives a lot of those lines, but you can see that at the end of the presentation, and I'm sure that it's $1.8 billion, and that's general revenue money. And we have to spend that. I mean, I don't see any way around, and you just can't go in there and cut those lines. I mean, it's there. So that, and when he says 2.5 billion, notice that lottery is in some of this. They're getting some lottery funds and some federal funds, and they're doing some things that, you know, we're probably, somebody I'm sure will ask about the Reese's. If they don't, I will. Somebody may ask about the Office of Educational Performance Audits. It's not a large amount of money, but it's there. And the challenge of the hour of trying to, and our new education chairman has taken on he's the subcommittee chairman of our committee that's looking at education. So anyway, I just, you know, if you're going to grapple with the budget problem, you must spend time looking at this presentation. And, you know, however you conclude what you conclude, I mean, it is what it is. It's the 240, how many students do we have, Doctor? I've forgotten. 273,000. 273,000 students in our system. So anyway, it was I appreciate the presentation. It told us a little bit about what is and what isn't and what the numbers are. So but now, you know, I'll open up the microphone for questions if somebody wants to ask any questions about this. All right, I see the senator from the 8th is going to start.
Yeah, and I'm new at this, so I don't know who I'm asking, but and some of these might sound silly to some of you, but they're not to me. Account 0317, would somebody tell me a little more what you meant by the equity adjustment?
Certainly. Statute currently requires that all of the salary tables for the county boards of education be considered.
Would you pull that thing down a little bit?
Sorry, considered to be what's within equity. And it's defined as the bottom counties, their average of their pay tables have to be within 90% of the average of the salaries being paid by the top 10 counties. And so for professionals, we've been within equity, and there's never really been a problem. But the service personnel, when one of those counties in the top 10 gives a pay increase with their excess levy dollars, then it brings the bottom counties out of equity. And so every year it's in statute that we have to calculate what additional amount of money it would cost to give the pay increase to those service personnel to bring those tables back within equity.
And the same thing apply to professional educators?
That same concept applies to professional educators.
It's in statute also?
It's in statute also, but we do not, there's no issues with the professional equity tables at this time. They are within that statutory definition of equity.
Okay, thank you. Let's see. Account 0390 lists these vocational programs. There's some income associated with those too, isn't there? I mean, some of these students pay a fee.
I think you're correct. Honestly,
Where would that show up? In the counties? I mean,
I believe all of those are at the county level, aren't they?
Yes, if a county was to charge adult student tuition, then those funds would be received at the county level and in the county Board of Education spending. And it is in statute that if they charge tuition, that those funds have to be expended for that adult educational program. So they can only spend that tuition to further those adult educational programs.
but they still get the same amount of dollars from the state regardless. I mean, they could get 50% of their costs through these tuition fees, and you'd still give them the same amount of dollars.
Well, the money that's coming from here are grant funds, and those are normally for maybe specific programs. They can only charge tuition to adult students There are some adult students who they do not charge tuition, and if they are in a secondary program, like say they started a welding program as a senior and it's a 2-year program, they come back after they've graduated and finished that, they don't charge tuition, and those students actually get counted in the funding formula, and the county would receive some state aid. But the rest of these line items are specific grants to the county school boards to do like like an LPN program or a
Yeah, I
specific
understand. So the answer is yes. They'll get the same dollars regardless of how much they take in tuition.
I would assume that they would not charge tuition on programs where they are receiving a grant, but I would have to confirm that with those county boards of education,
Senator,
if they're not kind of double dipping on that.
Senator, I believe the senator from Marion, with his long-time experience with education, wants to weigh in if you'd like for him to give you an answer.
Yeah, I'd just like to know.
Certainly. As a former vocational director, county administrator, in running the adult programs, adult and career education, we had the option to develop programs that meets the needs of our workforce development. And in conjunction with the vocational centers and a lot of businesses throughout the area, we would put in for a grant to create a program like one we had, computer integrated manufacturing, where we combined a number of different programs. The state gave us a grant. Generally, it just covered the teacher salary. It was up to us to go back and get a tuition model that we would procure certain equipment. You know, it's very expensive to run computer programs. It's expensive to run trade and occupational programs. So we would use the tuition money. All the money had to be spent back into the program and to keep it upgraded and things of that sort. So primarily when we get a grant from the state, it would pay for the instructor. We would go out in conjunction with the tech center, who had, you know, the facility and sometimes some of the equipment, and run programs of that sort. And these programs were meant to meet the immediate needs of the workforce in our particular area. So the money we got from the state never incurred all the costs. It was up to us to develop some kind of funding source so, you know, we could pay for the materials and things that are incurred in running classes. So we never got the total amount. I mean, it's not like the state aid formula where you had a certain amount of students and you'd be reimbursed in that aspect in the form of a grant. You know, we would write the proposal for a particular program, make sure we enrolled all the students, and then use that tuition money to pay for the ongoing program cost. Yeah. A lot of times in the event, you know, we utilized the tech centers because they had the equipment, and a lot of times we had that relationship. So it was an ongoing workforce program that met the immediate needs of the workforce in our particular counties, and it gave flexibility throughout the state. The needs we had in Marion County were certainly different than the needs up in, you know, Martinsburg and down in Charleston and things of that sort. So we were always coming up short, and I know one of the things that we tried to do was the equipment money to try to upgrade this equipment. It's very expensive to run those type of programs as opposed to running, you know, a basic English program or math program of that sort.
Thank you, Senator. That's very helpful. Speaking of grants, I assume you receive grants, mostly from the federal government.
That's correct.
Probably 100% maybe, I don't know.
Well, there are a few other grants, Benedum Foundation,
Yeah.
And a few others.
And you develop programs around those grants, am I right about that?
Well, yeah, with each federal grant that we get, I mean, obviously there's a scope and purpose behind each, you know, be it Title I, Title II, IDA, whatever it may be.
And I don't want to be difficult. I don't want it to sound like I'm just trying to understand. So,
Sure.
You know, I've been in organizations before that rely on grants, and you live and die with grants. Mm-hmm. If grants dry up, what happens? Does the program go away, or do you try to fund it?
Okay.
Let me define Dr. Martirano again. When we're talking the grants where we receive the most of our income from, as far as from the federal government, those are title grants. Title I is a huge piece of an account where we receive a lot of federal funds. Those dollars are intended to provide additional enhancements to our young people who live in poverty, et cetera. We are not applying for those grants. It's a difference in terms of a grant that has a 3-year lifespan, that has a life expectancy, and then sunsets at a different time. We are strictly, when we're talking the grants here, the major ones from the federal government.
And they continue?
And they continue,
in perpetuity?
Yes, they do, unless there would be a major reduction at the federal government. And keep in mind, all of those dollars that we received to the tune of approximately $500 million have specific tight guardrails around them for how we spend those dollars, particularly around Title I, supplement, not supplant. So we can't use those dollars for additional things. We have to supplement to provide more supports from young people in extreme poverty.
And no matching, right?
No.
So what would you do if those go away?
Oh my goodness, it would be an absolute crisis for us, because we are in reliance on approximately, like I just said, approximately $500 million comes from the federal government in all of our title funds.
Yeah. Last question. It's hard to look at these big numbers and see it, but I know, for instance, that you all have contracts with third-party vendors for various things, right? I'm assuming testing, curriculum, those kind of things. Can you give us a feel for how much those amount to?
Yeah, so there are 4 lines, 3 categories, and again, for your edification, new to this booklet, I've outlined each one of those accounts in the back. Cross-references is a particular page, an account. There are approximately 3 accounts in there for our assessments that total around $7 or $8 million. That is with our Smarter Balance contract this year. We recognize that Smarter Balance is going away, and we can't continue based upon